Welcome to our podcast, Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction about the Middle Ages. Today's episode explores the development of the Arthurian legend from the Middle Ages to its modern incarnation in literature and films. I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. My co-hosts are my better half and my inspiration for all things medieval, Ellen, and my good friend and longtime colleague, Dr. Jennifer Paxton of the Catholic University of America. Some of you may know Jenny from her great courses, videos, and her Smithsonian Associate Lectures. Jenny, we're delighted to have you back.
And I'm delighted to be back. It was a lot of fun discussing with you and Ellen the evidence for a historical King Arthur. But I think that today's subject, the development of the Arthurian legend, is even more interesting.
I totally agree. As a historian of early Britain and a teacher, I enjoy wrestling with the question of Arthur's historical existence, even if it's unsolvable given our current state of knowledge. But I also see the historicity of Arthur as a distraction from historically more critical questions. What happened in Britain after it withdrew from the Roman Empire in the early 5th century? What was the nature and impact of the migration of continental Saxons, Jutes, Angles, and Franks to Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries? This period of history, which historians call sub-Roman Britain, is a true dark age. Because of the lack of written sources, historians are forced to rely on the archaeological record. Archaeology is invaluable in providing information about living conditions, economy, and culture, but it depends upon written records to place this information into historical context.
The question of whether Arthur was a real person is, as Richard said, a fascinating puzzle for historians of late Roman and early medieval Britain. But why it has attracted popular and to some extent scholarly interest is Arthur's fame as a figure of legend. For many people, the name King Arthur conjures up a romantic image of the Middle Ages as an age of chivalry and faith.
Arthur in some ways reminds me of Robin Hood, the only medieval figure whose fame rivals Arthur's in the English-speaking world. The historical Robin Hood appears to have been a tenant of St. Peter's Church, York, named Robert Hood, also known as Hob Hood. For reasons unknown to us, he was outlawed in 1225. The Pipe Rolls of the Exchequer recorded that the Sheriff of Yorkshire owed 32 shillings and 6 pence to the Crown for the outlaw's confiscated chattels, a modest sum that placed this Hob Hood well below the rank of knight or gentry. Somehow this obscure individual became a magnet for good stories about outlaws. It wasn't until the 16th century that he became the famous Robin Hood, who led a band of merry men in Sherwood Forest, robbed from the rich, gave to the poor, romanced Maid Marian, and defended the weak against the tyranny of the Sheriff of Nottingham and bad Prince John, while good King Richard the Lionheart was on crusade. We don't need to know anything about the historical Robin Hood to appreciate the legend. He became the good medieval outlaw, just as Arthur became the good medieval king.
We could do an episode on Robin Hood.
Only if you agree to watch a few movies with me.
Okay, well, we'll pass on Robin Hood then.
People like King Arthur. They want him to be real.
They want to believe that there is an underlying reality to the stories about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, even if these stories have nothing to do with sub-Roman Britain. And that brings us to today's episode, the development of the legend of King Arthur, the King Arthur familiar to most of our listeners. One of the sources of tension in T.H. White's The Once and Future King is the cultural divide between the chivalric Norman French knights represented by Lancelot and the heroic, though barbaric, Celts represented by Gawain and his brothers. Whatever one makes of this in the novel, and we may talk about that later, it does reflect a basic division in the development of the legend of King Arthur. There is a Welsh Breton Arthur and an Anglo-French Arthur that to some extent Sir Thomas Malory integrated in his late 15th century masterwork, Le Morte d'Arthur. Since the Welsh Arthur is the earlier of the two, let's begin with him. Jenny, at the end of the previous episode, you said that there are a number of Welsh stories about Arthur dating to the 10th and early 11th centuries. So why don't you tell us a little bit about them?
The earliest full story we have concerns the hero Kilhwch, who has to complete a number of impossible feats before he can marry the heroine, Olwen, the daughter of the fierce giant Ysbyddaden. Kilhwch offends his stepmother by refusing to marry her daughter, and the witchy stepmother curses him that he will not be able to marry anyone except for the giant's beautiful daughter. Despite never having seen Olwen, Kilhwch immediately falls madly in love with her and vows that she will be his bride.
A case of love before first sight.
Apparently. Kilhwch's father warns him that to do so, he will need the aid of his famous cousin, King Arthur. Arthur agrees to give him whatever aid he requires, except for use of his sword and his wife.
Okay.
Okay, sworded wife. Yeah.
Knowing that the giant Ysbyddaden will not give his daughter in marriage without presenting the would-be suitor with impossible tasks, Arthur sends Kilhwch off with a large retinue that includes his 6 greatest warriors, 3 of whom are regulars in the medieval Arthurian legend: Kai, the handsome Bedwyr, and the valiant Gwalchmai.
In other words, Kay, Bedivere, and Gawain?
Yes,
All right.
and a host of other attendants with less familiar names, including the great warrior from Celtic mythology, Gwyn ap Nudd. Arthur's court in this tale is less like the Knights of the Round Table than it is like the superheroes of DC Comics' Justice League or Marvel's Avengers. Kai, for example, we are told, held his breath for 9 days underwater, and when he wished, he could grow to the size of a tree. Kilhwch needs their special talents to fulfill a series of impossible and potentially fatal tasks that Ysbyddaden requires of suitors of his daughter. The giant's reluctance is because of his daughter, that when his daughter marries, it would mean his own death.
And why is this tale so important in the development of the Arthurian legend?
The story itself isn't, but it includes 2 lists that are critical. One of the personages associated with King Arthur's court, and the other of the deeds of King Arthur and his great knights. It's a who's who of Welsh Arthurian legend. The story is also our earliest full tale in which King Arthur and his court play a major role. Some of the references in the lists are really sketchy, as if they're more of a kind of aide-memoire for an audience that already knows these tales. So the story is an indication that stories about Arthur are well and truly developed by around 1100. And for proponents of the historical Arthur, this is part of the no smoke without fire argument.
You know, I encountered this story as a child in the Mabinogion, a compilation of Welsh medieval hero stories that was translated by Lady Charlotte Guest. My grandfather, Simon, had a copy, which I read whenever we visited my grandparents. I only later learned, after he died and I inherited it, that it was a copy from the Brooklyn Library that had been taken out in 1904 and never brought back. I don't think I told you that, Elle, knowing that you would have insisted that we pay the fine.
Well, or at least give the book back. But anyway, Janny, you also mentioned in the last episode that Arthur appears in a number of early medieval Welsh saints' lives. What role does he play in them, and how would you characterize the King Arthur of those Welsh stories?
We've already seen that the Arthur of Kilhwch and Olwen is a pretty legendary figure. He shows up in just the same way in the lives of saints that were written in the 11th century in Wales. In these stories, Arthur acts as a kind of foil for the saints. He does something to annoy the saints, who then perform appropriate miracles, and then Arthur wises up and submits to the authority of the saints. But he's clearly not an unambiguously virtuous figure. Just one example from the life of St. Cadoc, who was supposedly born in 497 AD, though the details of this are pretty hazy. Cadoc gave sanctuary to a man who was accused of killing 3 of Arthur's men. and Arthur was furious. He demanded compensation in cattle. And then, just to be difficult, when they were produced, he demanded that the cattle be of a certain rare color, as if to say, really, I'm not going to accept compensation. By the power of the saint, the cattle were changed to the requisite color, and the transaction was accomplished. But the saint got the better of the king, because after Arthur had departed with the cattle, they were immediately changed into bundles of ferns.
What?
Now, the fact that this kind of thing happens with Arthur repeatedly in the lives of different saints makes one suspicious. He is clearly a literary convention here.
And he loves ferns. Okay.
Well, the thing about colored cattle is in Irish mythology.
Yeah.
Okay, we're getting sidetracked again.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. So you're dating this story about Coleridge and Owen to the 10th or 11th centuries, but if I remember correctly, the early surviving manuscripts for the story of 14th century. So why date it that early?
It's a matter of language. The Culhwch and Olwen story is in Middle Welsh, which dates it to the 11th or 12th centuries. Literary scholars are divided on when precisely.
And why is that important?
The key issue is whether it was composed before or after 1138.
Okay.
Because that's the year when the famous text, The History of the Kings of Britain, the Historia Regum Britanniae, appears. This text purports to trace the history of Britain from its founding by Brutus, a great-grandson of the Trojan Aeneas, to the death of King Cadwaladr of Gwynedd in Wales in the late 7th century. A third of the work is devoted to Arthur. It proved to be so popular that literary scholars use its publication as a test for whether a work can be legitimately considered evidence for a historical Arthur or the memory of a historical Arthur. The assumption is that anything composed after 1139, when we know that the history of the kings of Britain was in circulation, is, quote-unquote, contaminated by it.
The first half of the 12th century was a golden age of Anglo-Norman historical writing. Modern historians, though always conscious of the differences between modern historical writing and the agendas of medieval historians, admire the works of Orderic Vitalis, John of Worcester, Henry of Huntingdon, and William of Malmesbury. These historians really tried to get it right. And because of that, they couldn't compete in the marketplace with the fabulous stories told by Geoffrey.
Well, how do we know that? It's not like there was a New York Times bestseller list.
No, we do it by looking at manuscript survival. There are 225 extant 12th and 13th century manuscripts of the history of the kings of Britain.
Wow.
In contrast, William of Malmesbury's Deeds of the Kings of England, considered one of the best primary sources for the period, survives in about 20 manuscripts. Orderic Vitalis's The Ecclesiastical History survives in the author's own autographed copy in his Abbey at St. Avril, and in one other 12th century manuscript copy at the Abbey of Caen. Modern historians love these works. They are our primary sources. Apparently, however, contemporaries much preferred stories about King Arthur and Britain's legendary past.
You sound annoyed.
I guess I am. You know, you go to Barnes & Noble and you look at the shelves, they're filled with books by popular historians who regularly outsell academic historians whose work they use.
Not that you're taking it personally or anything.
I wish I could sell more books.
Okay, never mind. And if academic historians learn to write a little better, they might sell more books too. I mean, as a kid, I loved the Plantagenet histories of Thomas Costain.
You're right. Academic historians tend to write for other academics. The gold ring is getting tenure. Narrative history is not our forte. Popular historians write to entertain and to sell books. The really good ones, like Mark Morris and Dan Jones, both entertain and inform. The best book about the development of the Arthurian legend is by Richard Barber, the publisher of Boydell Press. Barber, at least in the U.S., would be regarded as a popular historian, although he knows more about medieval knighthood and chivalry than just about any academic historian of his generation.
Well, isn't that kind of what you're trying to do in this podcast, to be serious yet popular?
Yeah, and in my preparation for this particular episode, I reread Richard Barber's King Arthur, Hero and Legend. Jenny, what do you think Geoffrey of Monmouth's goal was in writing the history of the kings of Britain? Was he writing it as an entertainment?
I'm not sure that his goal was to entertain. Even the serious medieval historians you mentioned wrote to teach moral lessons. I think Geoffrey created a history of Britain that was meant to be a mirror for princes. He wrote at a time of looming political instability. This is right before the English Civil War of the 1130s and 40s breaks out. His Arthur was the type of king that Geoffrey believed England needed. But it's hard to escape the conclusion that Geoffrey, unlike, for instance, William of Malmesbury, was more than willing to fill in historical gaps by making things up. And everything prior to Caesar's invasion of Britain was a gap.
Henry of Huntingdon, who is a really good historian, tells us that he had looked in vain for information about Britain before the coming of the Romans when he wrote his chronicle. Then, on a visit to the Abbey of Bec in Normandy in 1138, much to his surprise, he discovered in that library a copy of Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, and it was all there.
Yeah, right.
Geoffrey was conscious that he was filling a gap in his contemporaries' more prosaic writings. In his preface, he pointed out with disingenuous wonder that, quote, I was surprised that among the references to the kings of Britain in the fine works of Gildas and Bede, I had found nothing concerning the kings who lived here before Christ's incarnation, and nothing about Arthur and the many others who succeeded after it, even though their deeds were worthy of eternal praise and are proclaimed by many people as if they had been entertainingly and memorably written down. Fortunately, his good friend Walter, the learned Archdeacon of Oxford, came to his rescue. Walter presented him with, quote, a certain very ancient book written in the British language, which he asked Geoffrey to translate into Latin. If that book actually existed, it has long since disappeared.
How seriously do historians take that?
Most scholars dismiss it as a standard trope of medieval epic and historical writing. In the Middle Ages, innovation and originality were not admired. To be taken seriously, one needed to cite authorities.
Which was true also in theological debates.
And in law, yeah.
It's interesting, though, that Geoffrey cited a double authority, the ancient book written in the British language and Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. Both were there to vouch for the tradition.
So where did he really get the material?
Most historians believe that he largely made up what he didn't take from Nennius. He does write that he supplemented what he learned from the ancient book given to him by Archdeacon Walter with stories about Arthur and other British heroes that he had heard as a boy, presumably in the southern Welsh marches around Monmouth.
Well, it's with Geoffrey that we see the true beginning of the medieval King Arthur. The author of the Mabinogion and early Welsh tales is a pre-courtly chieftain. Although magic plays a part in the later Arthurian stories, the Welsh author's court seems to be rife with it. His warriors are more like superheroes than knights. Jenny, how did Geoffrey shape the story of King Arthur? What exactly do we owe to him?
It is with Geoffrey of Monmouth that we see the first significant stage in the development of the medieval legend of King Arthur. After the Norman conquest of 1066, the new arrivals from the continent became fascinated with the stories about King Arthur and adopted them as their own. Since the Normans initially formed the elite of English society, their taste became the taste of all aspiring people, and by the 13th century, the story of a British hero who had resisted the Anglo-Saxons had been embraced by all English people, regardless of ancestry. On one level, of course, this embrace of a Celtic-speaking hero was ironically somewhat fitting, since many English people had Celtic-speaking ancestors of whom they were by this point totally unaware, because, of course, the Anglo-Saxons and the Celts had merged as a people in the period precisely when the supposed historical Arthur was supposed to have existed.
Yeah.
The main message of the story of King Arthur is that certain myths are destined to become universal. Who can resist the once and future king?
And we will be returning to this idea of Arthur as a once and future king.
The Arthurian tradition takes a dramatic turn in the 12th century when the Norman conquerors of England make a kind of cultural alliance with the traditions of the Celtic-speaking world. Up to this point, the traditions concerning Arthur have been considered to pertain to what later people call the Celtic fringe. But in the 12th century, the Normans embraced this tradition.
That makes some sense. After all, the Normans and the Britons did have a common enemy, the Saxons.
And the story really takes off with Geoffrey. The history of the kings of Britain is a sprawling work that covers the largely legendary early history of the island of Britain before the arrival of the Romans. Geoffrey claimed that his book was actually a translation of an ancient work in the British language. It was very controversial at the time. Many accepted it as a true record of the past,
including Henry of Huntingdon,
while others pointed out inconsistencies in chronology, and they more or less dismissed the whole thing as fiction.
William of Malmesbury never directly criticized Geoffrey of Monmouth, but he didn't choose to add any of Geoffrey's Arthurian stories into revisions of his own history of the kings of England. And when we come to the late 12th century, we find Gerald of Wales, who liked good stories, completely rejecting Geoffrey as a purveyor of fictions. But his contemporary, William of Newburgh, wins honors for the scathing review. Quote, "A writer in our times has started up and invented the most ridiculous fictions concerning the Britons. Having given in a Latin version the fabulous exploits of Arthur, drawn from the traditional fictions of the Britons with additions of his own, and endeavored to dignify them with the name of authentic history, no one but a person ignorant of ancient history, when he meets with that book, which he calls the History of the Britons, can for a moment doubt how impertinently and impudently he falsifies in every respect. Since, therefore, the ancient historians make not the slightest mention of these matters, it is plain that whatever this man published about Arthur and Merlin are mendacious fictions, invented to gratify the curiosity of the undiscerning. Therefore, let Bede, of whose wisdom and integrity none can doubt, possess our unbounded confidence, and let this fabler with his fiction be instantly rejected by all." End quote.
Don't hold back, William.
Tell us what you really think.
Right?
Yeah.
What really separates Geoffrey's historical writing from those of his contemporaries is his willingness to include obviously mythical material. He invented Brutus to provide Britain with a Trojan founder.
Geoffrey found Brito in Nennius's History of the Britons. For both Nennius and Geoffrey, the story of Brito was a matter of national pride. If Rome had a Trojan founder, then I guess that Britain also had to have a Trojan founder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're grafting themselves onto this master European narrative. The History of the Kings of Britain provides the nugget of the stories for Shakespeare's plays King Lear and Cymbeline. And this is where we find the origins of the Old King Cole of the famous nursery rhyme. But really, it's King Arthur who is the breakout hit. Geoffrey kept the Ambrosian tradition in Gildas and Nennius, but here he calls him Aurelius Ambrosius and identifies him as the son of King Constantine. This is totally new, and it probably represents a garbled attempt to reflect the context of late Roman Britain, in which there was a real usurping emperor named Constantius, the father of the later emperor Constantine.
Right.
Yeah.
Ambrosius is now one of three brothers, the oldest of whom is killed at the behest of the treacherous Vortigern, who gets increasingly bad press as the stories of this era develop. Vortigern is just the deepest and darkest of villains. Ambrosius has a younger brother, Uther, who takes the throne after Ambrosius is treacherously poisoned. Uther then becomes the father of Arthur, making Ambrosius Arthur's uncle. And here we see the development of the familiar legend. This family relationship is going to have a future.
Yeah.
He claims that he drew upon Welsh stories that he heard growing up, and there is evidence of that in the history. Arthur's sword is called Caliburnus. This is the later Excalibur, and this derives from Caledwch in the Welsh stories. He introduces in the Arthur story and transforms the prophetic Welsh bard Myrddin, whom he renames Merlin.
Wait a minute. How does Myrddin become Merlin? Shouldn't it be Myrddin?
Linguistically, yeah, it should be. But as one scholar pointed out, the name Myrddin would have had unfortunate connotations for a French-speaking audience.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Apparently, the first part of the history that Geoffrey wrote was a section called The Prophecies of Merlin, which circulated as a separate work. Geoffrey's Merlin is not only a prophet, but a wizard. He is responsible for the birth of the hero Arthur by transforming Arthur's father Uther into the likeness of his enemy Gorlois of Cornwall, so that Uther can have sex with his wife Igernia.
Okay.
Geoffrey's Arthur doesn't have a round table. We owe that to the late 12th century Anglo-Norman poet Was, who reconceived Geoffrey's history into a French poem. But the young king, quote, invited unto him all soever of most proofs from far-off kingdoms, and began to multiply his household retinue, which sounds like the beginnings of the Round Table. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote at a time that England was on the verge of civil war, so a main theme of his work is the necessity of strong and legitimate central rule. Arthur is for Geoffrey an ideal ruler because he is strong, shrewd, and just. In fact, he probably is Henry I.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that.
There's a stretch.
Remember that Henry I had only recently died.
That's true. Okay.
And Henry I was praised as a Rex Pacificus, a king who maintained justice and imposed peace upon the realm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Geoffrey also attached to Arthur the imperial ambitions of 4th and early 5th century Roman generals in Britain, like Magnus Maximus, who was remembered in Wales as Maxen Vladic, and Constantine III. After uniting Britain, Arthur conquers Gaul. When a Roman procurator sends him a letter demanding the return of the territory and the payment of back tribute owed by Britain to the emperor in Rome, Arthur responds by raising an army of 183,200 knights and innumerable foot soldiers. Geoffrey's account of Arthur's expedition to the continent mixes hero tales with history. Arthur's expedition begins with his personal victory over the giant of Mont Saint-Michel, ravaging the territory of Arthur's Breton ally Hoel, and had kidnapped his daughter. Arthur's campaign is victorious. The Roman Emperor Lucius falls in battle, but so do Kai and Bedivere. But as Arthur prepares to march on Rome, he receives news that his nephew Mordred, to whom he entrusted the kingdom in his absence.
Wait a minute, nephew? I thought Mordred was his bastard son by his half-sister Morgane.
Not at this point. It wasn't until about 1230 that the anonymous author of the so-called Lancelot Grail or Vulgate cycle of Arthurian stories transformed Mordred into the bastard product of an incestuous relationship. You know, the story was constantly evolving.
Or devolving in some ways.
So at the moment of his greatest triumph, Arthur learns that his nephew Mordred has usurped the crown and is about to marry Queen Guinevere in the later stories, having spread the story that Arthur was dead. Arthur returns to Britain, engages Mordred in battle in Cornwall, and it is a bloodbath in which Mordred and all of his followers are killed. Arthur is severely wounded and taken to Avalon to be healed. Guanuara retires to a convent, and the kingdom passes to Constantine.
And after this, Geoffrey's history becomes more factual and moves on a lot quicker. Richard Barber makes the point that Geoffrey didn't simply combine the Arthur of Nennius and Welsh legend, but created an entirely new character. In Barber's words, quote, Geoffrey seems to be attempting to provide the Britons with an emperor hero to whose golden age they could look back with pride. In other words, Arthur was the British Charlemagne.
Geoffrey's work inspired tales of King Arthur in both Anglo-Norman French and Middle English. By the mid-1150s, there were two poetic translations of the work in French, the first by Geoffrey Gaimard, which does not survive, and the second by Was, and this one proved to be highly influential. Around 1200, an English poet translated and adapted Was's poem into Middle English. And via the mysterious process of fusion between Anglo-Saxon and Norman that occurred in the 12th century, by the later Middle Ages, the English in general had adopted King Arthur. They no longer saw him as a Welsh hero who had resisted their ancestors. Rather, they viewed him as a great king from their legendary past. These stories tended to skip over the very specific historical context of the fall of Roman Britain and the age of Anglo-Saxon settlement. Instead, the tales are set in a kind of timeless age of chivalry, in which the court of King Arthur is a highly idealized version of a 12th century court. Ironically, Geoffrey's work was also translated into Welsh, and the Welsh version served as a kind of rallying cry for the Welsh in resisting the English. So Geoffrey's text ended up having completely opposite effects on the two sides of the Welsh-English conflict. Just one of the many strange twists in the story of King Arthur.
Is this when Arthur became the once and future king?
Geoffrey of Monmouth is really vague about this. He leaves Arthur gravely wounded and carried off to the Isle of Avalon to be tended by Morgan le Fay and 8 other women. Geoffrey, in his Life of Merlin, leaves open the possibility that Arthur would someday return when the Britons most needed him. When Geoffrey wrote, the idea of Arthur as the once and future king was already being brooded about. William of Malmesbury, writing around 1125, mocked what he called ancient idle talk that Arthur would return, which he attributed to the failure to locate Arthur's tomb. A decade later, another Anglo-Norman cleric and historian, Henry of Huntingdon, wrote to a Breton friend about his discovery of Geoffrey of Monmouth's book. In that letter, he says of Arthur that the Bretons, your ancestors, refused to believe that he died and solemnly await his return. This idea became what historians call the Breton hope.
One of our listeners, Professor Christopher Barrard of Providence College, persuasively argues that the idea of Arthur as secular messianic redeemer wasn't an ancient tradition of the Bretons or Welsh, but in fact arose in relation to the First Crusade.
About the same time that Charlemagne became a once and future emperor for the French.
Yeah.
Like Barbarossa, who died on the way to the Crusades?
Like Barbarossa also, who's going to return someday.
Yeah.
Getting back to Geoffrey of Monmouth, one really can't exaggerate his importance in establishing King Arthur as one of the foremost medieval heroes. But his Arthur is still not the King Arthur familiar to our listeners. You can search Geoffrey's writings in vain for Lancelot, Galahad, Tristan, Camelot, The Sword and the Stone, The Lady of the Lake, The Round Table, and The Grail Quest. All of these were added to the Arthurian legend between 1170 and 1250. Geoffrey's Arthur was more courtly than the Arthur of the Welsh tales, but it was left to a series of French writers of the late 12th and 13th centuries to make him and his court into the epitome of chivalry. The process began with a poet from the Channel Island of Jersey, Was, whom we spoke about. Was, writing for the court of the new Angevin king of England, Henry II, turned Geoffrey of Monmouth history into a French epic poem, and in the word of Christopher Barrard, quote, transformed Geoffrey's Arthur, a conqueror in the Norman mold, into a courteous, just, and mighty roi chevalier, a royal knight. As Geoffrey of Monmouth's Arthur was an idealized version of the Rex Pacificus, King Henry I of England, Wace's Arthur is modeled upon King Henry II.
So how did Wace get around the identification of Arthur with the Britons and the Welsh?
By declaring the Welsh of his day to be a degenerate race.
Yes, they're
okay.
just not what they were. And this was a view shared by the next writer to contribute to the development of the legend of King Arthur, Chrétien de Troyes. It's to Chrétien de Troyes that we owe Lancelot and his adulterous affair with Queen Guinevere, the Court of Camelot, and the Holy Grail. Like so many medieval authors, we know very little about Chrétien. He flourished in the second half of the 12th century and apparently came from Troyes in the county of Champagne. He tells us that he wrote Lancelot or the Knight of the Cart for his patron, Countess Marie de Champagne, the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and he wrote Perceval or the Story of the Grail for Philip of Alsace, Count of Flanders. The courts of the Counts of Champagne and Flanders were the centers of the chivalric courtly culture that developed in the 12th century. Ironically, this was because their counts were able to tap into the wealth generated by the medieval commercial and industrial revolutions. The textile industry of Flanders and the great medieval fairs of Champagne led to the emergence of a wealthy urban middle class, which in turn made it increasingly necessary for the landed nobility to justify its status as a social elite. They did this through the culture of chivalry, and the Counts of Champagne and Flanders had the wealth to serve as patrons for this cult of chivalry.
As we talked about in an earlier podcast.
Chrétien wrote several romances set in the court of King Arthur. Eric and Enid, Pléiade, Yvain or the Knight with the Lion, which I love, that's my favorite, Lancelot or the Knight of the Cart, and Perceval or the Story of the Grail. All of these center on the romantic adventures of the knights of Arthur's court. The court serves as a backdrop for the tales. Arthur himself is always in the background. Chrétien's Arthur is a great king with a mighty chivalric court, but he's also an old man whose days of heroic adventures have long since passed. When the naive young Perceval enters Arthur's court to demand to be knighted, he finds the king sitting at table, silently lost in thought, as his wounded knights chatter away. The boy gets the king's attention only when his horse knocks Arthur's hat off. Arthur apologizes and explains, quote, "Dear brother, welcome. I beg you not to take it ill that I failed to answer your greeting. My anger prevented a reply, for my greatest enemy I have, who hates and distresses me most, has just laid claim to my land, and is so impertinent as to state that he'll have it whether I like it or not. He is called the Red Knight. That knight would never have angered me by words alone, but he snatched away my cup and lifted it so insolently that it spilled all the wine all over the queen. After this dreadful deed, the queen returned to her chambers in deadly fury and grief." Well, this is hardly Geoffrey of Monmouth's warrior king, or even Mallory's. Although Chrétien introduced Lancelot's love affair with Queen Guinevere into the story, his model of chivalry is actually Sir Gawain. Chrétien reshaped Kay, the superhero of the Welsh Arthurian tales, into the antithesis of the courtly Gawain. Following Geoffrey of Monmouth, Chrétien made Kay into the seneschal, or steward of Arthur's court. He's characterized by his sarcasm and rudeness, for which he pays the price of being constantly humiliated by better knights.
Seneschals often get treated like that in the romances.
I suspect the troubadours did this to win over the household knights in his audience. Seneschals were in charge of the lord's household, including the training and disciplining of squires and knights. A seneschal was also the gateway to the lord, standing between the household knights and their lord's favor.
They were about as popular as assistant principals in high school?
About as popular as archdeacons were. They weren't popular either. I highly recommend Chrétien's Arthurian romances. They're just really good reads, and there are a number of affordable English translations of them. As I mentioned in our episode on medieval movies, the only fully authentic medieval movie I've ever seen is Eric Rohmer's 1978 Perceval le Gallois, a literal though highly stylized translation of the poem to the screen.
One of these is enough.
Yeah, you can actually see this movie, the full movie for free, online at Daily Motion.
Yeah, I know.
I haven't forced you to watch it. You would like it. Believe me, you really would like it.
I have sat through the first hour of it at least twice. Okay. Anyway, Chrétien's work did seem to open a floodgate to Arthurian romance writing in France, Germany, Spain, and England.
Chrétien was quickly followed in France by other trouvères and in Germany by minnesingers who added to the Arthurian legend. Chrétien's Grail is a mysterious object that appears to have been a communion dish rather than a chalice.
You mean a paten?
Yeah, a paten.
Okay.
Robert of Boron.
Robert of who?
Boron.
Okay.
Is the poet who transformed, it's about the year 1200, transformed that dish into the cup from which Jesus drank at the Last Supper and in which Joseph of Arimathea collected the blood of Christ. Chrétien's story of Perceval became the basis for Wolfram of Eschenbach's Parzival, the greatest of the German Arthurian romances. Arthur and his knights became a veritable mania among the aristocracy of the high and late Middle Ages. Arthurian stories were told not just in French, but in Italian, Spanish, German, and of course English.
Not surprising, given that the medieval European military aristocracy constituted an international class with a shared chivalric identity. French, German, Spanish, Italian, and English knights had more in common with each other than they had with their own peasants, townsmen, or clergy.
Arthurian-themed tournaments became a fad in the 13th and 14th centuries. In the mid-13th century, the German knight and minnesinger Ulrich von Liechtenstein, who
him again.
He dressed as King Arthur, went on a jousting tour in order to collect knights worthy for his round table. Ulrich's round table was small potatoes compared to those sponsored by Edward I and Edward III of England. The figure of King Arthur played an important role in the politics of England under the three Edwards. Edward I of England, who reigned from 1274 to 1307, and his grandson, Edward III, who reigned from 1327 to 1377, both modeled themselves on King Arthur. Supposedly, prophets predicted that Edward II would be the new King Arthur, but in fact, Edward II fell quite short of that. However, the man who may have been complicit in his murder, Roger Mortimer, lover of Queen Isabella and co-regent for the young Edward III, claimed direct descent from King Arthur. In 1344, King Edward III held a great round table tournament in Windsor, where he believed that Arthur had first constituted the actual round table, and a few years after that, he explicitly modeled his chivalric order of the Garter on the Fellowship of the Round Table.
And King Edward I ordered a replica of the Round Table be constructed out of oak as part of a Round Table tournament he held around 1290 in honor of the betrothal of one of his daughters, and it's now in display at Winchester.
Stories about King Arthur became so popular that they were the subject of a rather transparent and infamous hoax. In 1191, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey in the west of England dug up two skeletons that they claimed had belonged to Arthur and his queen Guinevere. There could be little doubt as to the identity of the couple. Placed on top of the coffin of the male was a lead cross inscribed with the words, Hic jacet sepultus Rex Arturus in insula Avalonia. Here lies King Arthur buried in the Isle of Avalon.
So Avalon is near Glastonbury? Okay, whatever.
Yeah, really fortuitous. Glastonbury was an extremely wealthy abbey, but it had fallen on pretty hard times because of a disastrous fire in 1184 that destroyed its ancient church.
So this discovery of the skeletons was very fortuitous. The curious flocked to Glastonbury to check it out. Such discoveries of burials were the stock in trade of stories about saints. since possession of the relics of saints helped to promote a church in the fierce competition for medieval pilgrims. But it was unusual for the body or bodies discovered to belong to a secular ruler whom nobody claimed had been a saint.
Yeah, that is interesting.
The site of the excavation of the graves is commemorated to this day at the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey, but the wording of the sign carefully does not take a position with regard to the authenticity of the remains.
Yeah, but that's done nothing to cool the enthusiasm of tourists. The discovery of the bones of King Arthur was not only fortuitous for the monks of Glastonbury, but it was also good for the Plantagenet dynasty that ruled England. Wass, as I had said, had equated Arthur with King Henry II, but there was still the nagging problem that the Welsh were expecting their Arthur to return and restore British rule over the entire island. It's interesting that Gerald of Wales, a court cleric who visited Glastonbury soon after the discovery and reported on it, claimed that King Henry II had initiated the project. The king, according to Gerald, had learned from a Welsh bard that Arthur was buried at Glastonbury, which had once been known as Avalon. The king urged the abbot to look into this matter. Whether or not Henry II was responsible, the hoax was convenient for the Plantagenets as it was for the abbey. If Arthur was buried at Glastonbury, he wasn't coming back to lead the Welsh to recover Britain. That was the nail in the coffin to Arthur as the once and future king.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Not by coincidence, in 1187, 4 years before the monks found Arthur's grave, the posthumous son of Geoffrey Plantagenet, Duke of Brittany, was christened Arthur.
Is that the Arthur that King John murdered?
Yep.
I thought so.
That was the Arthur that King John murdered.
Okay.
So Arthur had returned to Brittany. The burial of Arthur at Glastonbury was also important to King Edward I of England. In 1278, months after having defeated Llewellyn ap Griffith, Prince of Wales and ruler of Gwynedd, and compelled his homage, Edward visited Glastonbury. There he ordered the tombs of Arthur and Guinevere to be opened. After inspecting their bones, he ordered the monks to reverently translate the tombs and place them before the high altar in the church.
So Arthur once again is being treated like a saint.
But why?
By ordering a formal translation of the remains, Edward was confirming that he, as King of England, was in possession of Arthur's remains. He was also reaffirming his personal identification with Arthur. In other words, just as Edward was absorbing Wales into England, he was taking the Welsh great national hero and absorbing him into a different story, that of the rule of the kings of England over Britain.
Okay, back to the development of the legend. Okay, when did he become the figure we're familiar with?
It's around 1470 when Sir Thomas Malory wrote La Morte d'Arthur. But all the elements of the story had fully emerged in the 13th century in two massive French prose compilations. The Lancelot Grail or Vulgate cycle, completed around 1230, and the Post-Vulgate, what an imaginative name, the Post-Vulgate cycle, also known as the Grail cycle, produced around 1240. The authors are anonymous, although one manuscript of the Vulgate cycle claims Henry II's courtier Walter Map, who died in 1210, was its author. It's not possible. It was written after the death of Walter Map. What distinguishes both is that they are in prose, not poems. They are prose works and tell the story of Arthur from his prophesied birth to his death. The longest section in the Vulgate cycle concerns Lancelot and his love affair with Guinevere. Lancelot is presented as the model chivalric knight, although his affair with Guinevere culminates in the destruction of the Fellowship of the Round Table. Their adultery is exposed by Gawain's treacherous brother Agravain. Lancelot manages to escape, but Guinevere is caught and sentenced to be burned. Lancelot, of course, rescues her, but in doing so kills not only Agravain, who nobody would miss, but also his good brother, Gareth, Lancelot's friend and Gawain's most beloved brother. In enraged, Gawain insists upon vengeance, and Arthur goes to war against Lancelot. This war is interrupted by news that the Romans have ravaged Burgundy, and Arthur turns his attention to defeating them, with Arthur personally killing the emperor. News then arrives of that Mordred has usurped the throne. Gawain, who had been seriously wounded by Lancelot, recognizes Lancelot's virtue and love for Arthur and tells the king to call upon him for help. Lancelot responds, but it is too late. Arthur and Mordred have killed each other in battle. Lancelot, however, pursues and kills Mordred's two sons. And
Mordred had sons?
Yeah, and then he becomes a hermit.
The post-Vulgate cycle is a condensed and revised version. Scholars believe that the author may have been a Cistercian monk. The Lancelot section is severely abbreviated, and a quest for the Grail is expanded. The focus is not on the profane knighthood of Lancelot, but the spiritual knightly perfection of his son Galahad. The anonymous author also pulled Tristan into the Arthurian orbit.
These two cycles are the most prominent and influential works of Arthurian literature in the 13th century, but they're just the tip of the iceberg. The hero of much of French Arthurian poetry was Gawain, represented as brave, chivalric, and a flirtatious rake. But a very different Gawain emerges in the most famous Arthurian work of the 14th century, the Middle English poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And in this poem, Gawain is the model of chivalric duty and honor. In the middle of the celebration of the New Year, a giant dressed in green rides into King Arthur's court, carrying a large axe in one hand and a holly bough in the other. He tells the court that he hasn't come to fight but to play a game. He challenges any knight to strike him with the axe, and in return the knight will appear 1 year and 1 day later in the Green Chapel, where he will receive 1 blow from the axe, and no knight is willing to take the wager.
This is more prudent than knights usually are in medieval romances and epics.
So Arthur steps forward, but he's intercepted by Gawain, who begs him for the honor instead. So the Green Knight kneels, and with one stroke Gawain strikes off his head. So the Green Knight calmly picks up his head, reminds Gawain of their rendezvous, and rides off. The year passes, Gawain goes in search of the Green Chapel to pay his debt, and the poem is actually worth reading.
Spoiler alert. I'm about to tell you how Gawain's adventure turns out. So if you plan to read the poem and want to be surprised, turn down the sound for the next couple of minutes. Medieval authors delighted in presenting their heroes with moral conundrums for the edification and amusement of the young knights for whom they wrote. The anonymous poet of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is no different. Gawain technically fulfills his pledge to the Green Knight and survives to return to Arthur's court with his tale, but he does so by breaking another promise. After a number of adventures, Gawain is led to a castle that lies near the Green Chapel. It's only 3 days away from his promised rendezvous. As in so many romances, the lord of the castle is delighted to offer hospitality to so distinguished a knight, assuring Gawain that the Green Chapel is nearby. Gawain is received graciously by the lord's beautiful wife and an ugly old crone whom the lord and the lady treat with honor. The lord goes hunting every day and leaves Gawain in the care of his wife. He proposes that he and the knight should exchange whatever they had acquired each day. For 3 days in a row, the beautiful mistress of the castle attempts unsuccessfully to seduce Gawain. He courteously rebuffs her advances and only consents to give her kisses. At the end of the first day, the lord gives Gawain a deer, and Gawain gives the lord a kiss. On the second, he gives the lord 2 kisses in exchange for a boar. On the third and final day before he is due at the Green Chapel, Gawain gives the lord 3 kisses and receives a fox. The lord neither asks, nor does Gawain tell, from whom he had received these kisses. But Gawain has withheld one of his acquisitions. The lady of the castle had given to Gawain as a keepsake a girdle of green and gold silk with the magical property of protecting its wearer from any physical harm. Knowing that otherwise he was going to his death, Gawain accepted the gift and promised to keep it secret from her husband. By failing to give the girdle to the lord of the castle, Gawain had broken his promise to the lord. The next day, wearing the girdle, Gawain appears at the Green Chapel to submit to the old blow. The Green Knight twice feints a strike, and each time pulls back when Gawain flinches. The third time he swings the axe and brings it down, stopping right above Gawain's neck and gently nicks him. He then explains that this was, as he said, a game, and it was a game devised by the Green Knight's lord, Gawain's aunt Morgan le Fay. Morgan had wished to humble Arthur's proud knights and to give grief to Guinevere, whom she hated. The Green Knight reveals that he is, in fact, the lord of the castle whose hospitality Gawain had enjoyed, and the crone was Morgan le Fay magically disguised. The two feints were Gawain's penalty for having accepted kisses from his wife. The nick was the penalty for Gawain's failure to disclose the girdle. But ultimately, the Green Knight assures Gawain that he had shown himself to be an honorable knight. Gawain, chastened, returns to Arthur's court safe and sound, to the relief and happiness of all. But Gawain insists on telling them of his failure. He shows them the nick on his neck and the girdle, which he tells them is, quote, the badge of false faith that I was founded there because of cowardice and coveting. King Arthur and the knights and ladies of the court respond from that day forth, with each knight of the Round Table wearing a girdle as a symbol of fellowship. Scholars have seen this as an origin story for King Edward III's chivalric Order of the Garter. That order's motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, shamed be he who finds evil here, fits well into this story.
I know that T.H. White has been criticized for his anachronisms, but what strikes me is that he was very much attuned with the theme of the human frailty of even the finest knights. The themes of shame and moral compromise seem to run through so much chivalric literature.
We have so much more to cover that I think that this is a good time to break. We'll pick up in our next episode with Sir Thomas Malory's masterwork of Arthurian literature, Le Morte d'Arthur. Around the year 1470, Malory, an imprisoned knight, wrote a prose narrative that wove together, in English, all the threads of the medieval Arthurian legend, combining the historical writing of Geoffrey of Monmouth and French and Middle English romances. Malory established the familiar King Arthur of children's books, films, and novels. I hope that you will join Ellen, Jenny, and myself for our next and final episode of this series, as we trace the modern development of the Arthurian legend. We'll be talking about some of our favorite novels, in particular T.H. White's The Once and Future King. We'll also be talking about several films, some of them good, others not so good, and even how Arthur found his way into comic books and video games. And just a reminder, if you are enjoying the podcast, let friends, family, and if you're a teacher, students know about it. And the easiest way to keep up with the podcast is to subscribe to it on whatever podcast service you use. Bye for now. I hope you'll be joining us for our next episode.